Okay, welcome back to the Cinema of Transformation. This week's movie is Good Will Hunting, and this is about a young man who is brilliant on the inside, has a genius IQ, but on the outside he lives in South Boston, kind of the wrong part of town for that kind of a person. And this is about his struggle for identity, his conflict between his inner intelligence and his outside situation. So a large part of this is overcoming his circumstance. And part of his circumstance is not only his environment, but it's also his past, a history of abuse that he has to resolve through the help of a therapist. And it is through this relationship with his therapist, Sean, that Will has with Sean a symbiotic healing, that by Sean helping Will, Sean is also being helped by Will. So it's a back and forth. It's really very much a two-way street. In fact, sometimes it's kind of hard to tell who's the healer and who's getting healed, because they both need each other and have been brought together in this story so that they can heal their own pasts and get back on their own path. Okay, so Good Will Hunting, 1997 Best Screenplay with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. Best Supporting Actor, Robin Williams. Great performance. This was definitely an Oscar-worthy performance. Dramatic performance from such a great comic actor, Robin Williams. But definitely a great dramatic role that he plays in this film. Also Best Picture. So one of the themes and topics, I guess, that gets addressed so many times is this notion of vulnerability. Like, what are we able to share? That is, what are we comfortable with letting out? And what do we allow to come in? Generally, emotional vulnerability, usually in the context of personal relationships or anything that gets close. So this is Will's struggle with vulnerability, that he has built up these defense mechanisms to keep anybody from getting close, to keep him from getting too close to anybody else. And that's really not helping his growth at all, but it's protecting him. And it's this protective shell that gets broken down throughout this picture. And one of the things that Will is afraid to let out is his intelligence, is his light side, is the gold that he has within. And like a dragon from fairy tale myths who hoard the gold, he's hoarding his own gold. It's not that he's being selfish necessarily and keeping it from somebody else, but he's protecting it and protecting himself in the process. What we find, though, at some point in our lives, that what we're protecting, what we're holding in, is actually the thing itself that's going to help us in our development, in our growth, and, as we are talking about in this class, our transformation. Now, this is very much an inner journey. There isn't too many places where they go that can't be, either walked to or taken a train or a small car ride. So the environment is very small. The journey isn't externally very large. It's mostly an inner journey. Certainly the therapist sessions with Sean are all about an inner journey. But he also addresses the problems where he is. He doesn't need to go off on some big quest. That he lives and works and has his life in this area with these people. So that doesn't really change, but he changes through his situations, which is really kind of an interesting topic. Sometimes people do need to take an epic journey to leave town, to go way far away to find themselves, and then bring it back. He has to transform within, in the here and now, right where he is. So we'll follow him along through that. And this is Will, the hero, Will Hunting, using Bostonian terminology and that of New England. He's wicked smart and incredibly smart, like super, super gifted. But his life, his outer life, like I mentioned before, is South Boston. It's the other side of the tracks. He's a tough kid, at least tough on the outside, a fighter. And by fighter, I don't mean that he has a lot of willpower to overcome challenges. I mean, fighter like he fist fights, okay? And we'll see that in the movie. That's also one of his defenses. He kind of keeps people away by fighting anybody who comes close to uncovering maybe his true self that he really wants to hide. So he takes a train to MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he's a janitor. And a point is brought up where he could be a janitor anywhere, but he, rides 45 minutes in a train to go somewhere else, MIT, to be a janitor. So there's part of his personality is there. He knows he needs to be there, away from South Boston and get to one of these Ivy League schools, but he's afraid to, but he still does it. So he's dancing around with it. We see it coming out, even though he, on the surface, is very defended and very protective. So he has this violent streak, but emotionally he's very fearful, and I think the two are related. Again, that's a way of keeping people away. And he avoids his own potential. Maybe he feels he can't live up to it, or that people feel he needs to, and it should be up to him whether or not he uses his gifts. But he uses them anyway. So he's conflicted, to say the least, and this is the story about him resolving these conflicts. Now, the lover is Skylar, a student who is very smart, but she has to work hard. Will is very smart, and he doesn't have to work at all. He's just smart. He's just that way. And for Will, in addition to being a decent girl and a good love interest, a good lover for him, it's also she also represents something different, something out there. She's from England. At some point, she ends up moving to California to continue her education. So there's a little bit of not from Boston aspect of Skylar that is probably attractive for Will as well. And she represents, again, like a lot of the lovers and love stories and love interests, it's beyond just the human being and beyond the human love story. She represents, something that's good, something that's beautiful, something that's more refined, a person who can open up and connect with that part in Will that he's not really able to express in his outer life. Now, she's very open emotionally. She's not afraid to let her vulnerabilities, or if she is afraid, she still gets through it and expresses her feelings emotionally towards Will. And this ends up becoming very uncomfortable for Will because he's not that way. And the relationship gets to the point to where it gets to that uncomfortable feeling. It happens a lot in relationships. It's fine on the first couple of dates. You don't really know anything about someone's past, or you'll get found out if they get to know you too well. And then the honeymoon's over, the fairy tale's crushed. And then we just find out we're just real people with real problems and real baggage and real life like everybody else. But Will doesn't really want to go there just yet. Of course, he gets forced to as we move along. Now, one of his initial allies, which is very adversarial at first, is this Professor Lambeau at MIT. He's the one that put the math problem on the chalkboard in the hallway that Will was able to solve. He is a bona fide math genius. He is a Fields Medal honoree, a winner of this coveted math prize. And he's very comfortable in his situation. You can see in this top picture, he's, got these big chalkboards behind him, and he's this towering figure, looming large, this great mind, this great intellect. And I think he thinks he's a pretty great person as well. Now, at first, he scolds Will for writing on the chalkboard, thinking that this guy is just some janitor that's, writing graffiti on the chalkboard, but then finds out he actually solved this incredibly hard math problem. And he offers him a deal that he'll keep him out of jail as long as he stays under his wing, and does some long division and some hard math for him, and really kind of give him a shot. So here's another underdog story where somebody comes in and really tries to give him a shot. Now, Gerald Lambeau knows Sean, who is the Robin Williams character, the therapist, and they have a history that we'll get into and we'll see. But his presence and his, I don't know if it's, manipulation or in just trying to insert himself. He's trying to help, really. But by him becoming involved in Will's life and also Sean's then through Will, that it is a catalyst for both of them. It is the call to action. It gets them, even though they weren't asking for it or looking for it, he shows up. So he's adversarial in some ways, but he's also an ally. He means well, and he does things the best that he can with what he has to offer. And of course, he sees Will's incredible potential and is just amazed by it. Now, we get to the mentor. This is Sean, and he's a therapist. And he becomes somewhat of a father figure. They're both from South Boston. So in that way, he really connects on a street level, environment, just a way of doing things, a way of looking at the world, only like a Southie can. So they're both Southies. So they have this level that they connect with. But he's also a math genius. He went to school with Lambeau and took a different path in his career than Gerald Lambeau did. But he's definitely cut from that same cloth as well. So he has a foot in both worlds, that of Lambeau as well as Will. So he ends up really being the perfect therapist for Will, because he also has a history of abuse and carries a huge burden of pain from the death of his wife, also a Vietnam War vet. So he has his story and his history, and he brings that to the table. Now, the posse, the allies, these are Will's friends. His best friend is Chuckie. Chuckie comes by and picks him up for work. I guess he's the only one of the group that has a car. And he's, no genius by any stretch, but he has his own wisdom too, and he's able to see things in a way that maybe Will can't. Of course, we all have a blind spot, and sometimes we need a best friend or a friend to tell us something, point something out. A lot of the times we don't like hearing it at first, but it's usually coming from a good place. And sometimes the reason why we don't like hearing something is because it's actually true, which is why we don't want to hear it. But he also, of course, recognizes very much Will's potential and pushes him to use it. The other two guys, Morgan and Billy, Morgan's the little guy, and together, the four of them have this gang, this posse. They would do anything for each other, stop a bullet. They go out drinking together. They hang out. They work together. They're just this group of four that gets through their lives and their situation in South Boston. So that's his group of allies. Now, as we move into the hero's journey, in the first section, the departure, this is Will departing from him just being a janitor, just keeping these gifts inside, just hanging out with the guys drinking. The call is, comes through Lambeau, and that's to, hey, I'll get you out of jail and keep you under my wing as long as you promise to do some math. And, it probably makes him look good as well, having a boy genius on his side. And that gets rejected at first, but when faced with jail time and really no other better offer on the table, Will accepts and agrees to do this or work this arrangement with Lambeau. So that's the departure. Now, actually, this refusal of the call and the departure, it's kind of what the whole movie is about. There's an actual departure, which happens the very, very last shot as Will leaving town. Spoiler alert. But he's refusing the calling of his own inner urge, his own potential, to heal his past, to do all these things. And it gets called up, and he accepts as he goes along throughout the movie. But it's really all about a lot of refusing this call to something greater. He fights it the whole way through on a lot of levels, But by the end, he really transforms and has fantastic growth. Okay, then after a departure, of course, we have the initiation phase. This starts out with several therapists, some that didn't work. Most of them didn't work until they got hooked up with Sean. And there's some tit or tat. He goes out on a date with Skylar, and there's some trials, and there's some learning, and things start to get okay until like the midpoint, where there really seems to be a connection. Will and Skylar deepen their connection with each other. Finally, Will and Sean get around their South Boston standoff, and they bond over baseball. And I guess that's big in Boston. And Sean opens up and tells Will about his wife and the way they met, and more about the way she died. But this marks progress. Both cases with Skylar and with Sean, doors are opening, physical and emotional, and these connections are being made. And you can see Will start to open up and become emotionally vulnerable with both Skylar and Sean. So this is a really good point, but it also crosses a line. Now that he's open, okay, now some problems can arise, because especially if it crosses a line, he becomes a little more open than he's comfortable with, which is what you need to do to get through difficult points. And that culminates, as it usually does, in the appointment with death. And this is playing out on so many levels. Basically, it's all the relationships in the film. There's Sean and Lambeau. They have a history, like I mentioned. They argue over Will and what should or should not be done with him. Skylar is leaving Boston to go to California to continue studying. She tells him that she loves him and wants him to come to California, and his response is to break up and leave her. So there's the death of that relationship. Even Will and Lambeau have a falling out, so that's on the rocks. And finally, Sean and Will get to a point to where Sean has really had enough of Will's bullshit, and he tells him to get out of his office, kicks him out. Time's up. And this is really the low point. This is really everything that had been built up coming together. It has now fallen apart. Reason because it's been tested. And Will has been tested. And Will can't handle it. So his way to handle emotional difficulty is through confrontation and then finally leaving. So, and even Sean too, kick Will out of his office. So he has kind of a similar track there. So that's when everything falls apart. And in this breaking up and falling apart, now there's really nothing that'll break up those four, the four Southie guys, the posse. They are friends for life. But even still, and this marks really the beginning of the return. After all this breaking up, Will returns back to working the construction job with Chuckie, and is kind of back to his life, but it's not back to the old life because he's changed. He's had this exposure to these people and these relationships and things that have been brought up. So he really can't go back. He wants to, okay? He wants to just work construction and hang out with the guys and drink beer until he retires, and probably afterwards. But there's a really pivotal scene that happens, and I believe this is at the beginning of the return. So Will is back to work construction, and Chuckie tells him exactly how he feels about what Will is doing and why he thinks that Will owes it not to himself, but owes it to the other guys to do something with his life, because they can't. They don't have this gift, and Will does. And he even makes the analogy that it's like as if Will has a winning lottery ticket and he's, too afraid to cash it in. And he tells him, he says the best part of his day is when he goes to pick him up for work and he pulls up in his driveway and he hopes that when he knocks on the door, Will's going to be gone, disappeared, left completely, no note, no nothing. And here it is, this is his best friend, and he tells him his best part of his day is hoping that he'll go to Will's house and Will be gone. Wow. So that's the truth from your homie, from your best friend. He tells him how it is, and in no uncertain terms. He was very, very clear about it. This is also playing into the rule of three. The very opening scene is Chuckie coming up to Will's driveway to pick him up in his car for work. And then this is set up in the beginning of Act 3 with the return. And then in one of the very last scenes is when Chuckie comes to pick up Will, and guess what? Not there. He's not there anymore in the return. So finally, Will has the courage and the incentive to leave South Boston, and he does. And like I just mentioned, Chuckie gets his wish, and Will is gone when he comes to pick him up at the end, and no note. But he does leave a note for Sean. And he tells in this note to Sean that he had to go see about a girl, which is exactly the line that Sean used on his friend years ago when he met what would become his wife. So he recycled that line, and he gets a good laugh out of that. And so these are really very much new beginnings. This is really a departure. There's a new beginning for Sean. Sean is going to pack it up and go and throw his hat out in the ring. He had been living a very protective, defended life after his wife had passed. So through this connection with Will and helping him, he actually opened something up within himself. And Will challenged him. And just as Sean challenged Will, but they both got to a better place to where they're both getting out of their bubble and they're going to risk it again, get out there in life and give it another shot. And Will takes off to go to California to be with Skylar. And one of my favorite parts about the ending is that Morgan, the little guy, when Chuckie and the guys come to pick up Will and he's gone, Morgan gets his shot. He gets to sit in the front seat now. So that's his transformation. He goes from riding in the back to riding shotgun. So good for Morgan. And this is Good Will Hunting. Hope you enjoy the movie. It's very much a psychological tale. So when we're talking about the functions of myth, guess what? This probably has a lot to do with the psychological function and this sociological bit too, the third function of myth. So I want you to think of those things when you're watching this movie, and let me know in the forum discussion how you feel about some of the forum prompts, or if something comes up to you. Something is brought up in you that this movie inspired. I want to hear all about it. So happy watching. Good Will Hunting.